Angelo Matthews takes a catch on the Trent Bridge boundary. He throws the ball up in the air as the momentum takes him over the rope.
This is the last knot. My dad told me to say this.
But the ball drifts back with him over the boundary. Matthews, who is now on the wrong side of the rope, or padded triangle, or whatever you want to call it, jumps in the air, volleyball slaps the ball as hard as he can, and he just manages to clear the rope, go back, save the boundary, then he runs into the field and fires the ball back in. That might seem normal now, we see it all the time, but in 2009, that was Superman. And on that particular delivery, it wasn't just the fielding that was extraordinary. Sri Lanka had Ajanta Mendis bowling that delivery, a mystery bowler who could spin the ball both ways with off-spin, wrong-uns, and a new delivery which we called the Karen ball. The batter was Ramnara Shawan, who played a dirty, sloggy pull shot back over long on. Sawan was a distinguished, nuggety test batter, but here he sees a short ball and he tries to just hit it as hard as he can back down the ground for 6. Thinking about all this now, nothing I've just said is out of the ordinary. Of course a test player who is on the slow side would flat bat a spinner back down the ground. It makes sense that a bowler now would combine wrist spin, off spin, Karen balls, whatever he has to based on matchups. And fielding on the boundary now is very much on both sides of the rope. Cricket has been changed by the short formats, but even within that, T20 is constantly evolving itself. The first international T20 was a match between Australia and New Zealand, and some players wore wigs. There was an underarm ball. It was a circus, an actual circus, not just the one that people used to call it. Of course, if that makes it sound like the beginning of T20 was a bit rough and ready, it was actually slightly more polished than that. Surrey won the inaugural T20 competition in, well, the world, I suppose, but also in England. And most of their players have stated that they didn't take it seriously when it started because it was just for fun. But as they started to win matches, they're professional players and they started to take it more and more seriously. But if you do a deeper look at the first few seasons of T20, you can already see that teams are doing what Surrey did. They're starting to take it seriously. They're starting to think about it. Much of that is covered in the book, Cricket 2.0. And there was some random stuff as well, like Derbyshire believed in rotating the bowlers every over. So bowler 1, bowler 2, bowler 3, bowler 4. I think you're starting to get what I'm saying. John Inverarity thought you could win the game by scoring the most 2s, which I suppose is still the case probably at the MCG. Sussex and James Kirtley were inspired by Moneyball, the book, well before there was a movie, and he tried to get in the way of the batters with his follow-through. Not to mention that the batters were just attacking really, really hard, even more so than they would do over the next couple of years. Some of those theories might seem a little bit strange, but at the time they were probably cutting edge. And yet they are completely out of date now. No one cares about 2s in T20 cricket. There's no pattern in bowling rotations. Slowing down running between the wicket is no longer that essentials, and players obviously attack even more now than they did in that reckless era. T20 cricket is new, but it is almost unrecognisable from those early days. The first revolution off the field was capitalism. National teams are essentially government-run organisations. Even if it was not always directly done that way, that's kind of how cricket boards moved. They had no local competitors and they just sort of stuttered along like old men at the cash register. While international cricket often made big advances, many boards were actually very slow-moving. Perhaps the greatest example of this is England were wearing whites in ODIs at home until 1998. The IPL brought in team owners with business thinking and fresh markets, and perhaps the first time we saw that seeping onto the field was with the Rajasthan Royals, who openly embraced the Moneyball ideology. This is where ball-by-ball data became very important: matchups, runs in boundaries, and also dot ball percentage. But before Rajasthan, other teams had flirted with it. Early in English T20, teams worked out that left-arm pace was a vital part of the game. As far back as John Wright coaching at Kent and India in the 90s to the early 2000s, he was talking about dot ball percentage. And cricket's first analyst really was Krishna Tunga, who got the job by surprising Australian coach John Buchanan in a hotel lobby when Australia were on tour in India. These were moments, but now cricket had a movement. And suddenly there seemed to be smart teams and old school teams. Islamabad United, Perth Scorchers and Northants became the most known teams outside the IPL for using data and analytics and thinking about cricket just in a different way. But soon if you blogged about cricket and data more than a few times, you would end up as a consultant for a team. I mean, that is quite literally what happened to me. This was really the ball-by-ball era of T20. Often people would scrape data from ESPN Cricinfo, and that would be used to say that you should never bowl leg spin to Chris Gale, and that Martin Guptill really didn't like left arm seam that much. Weirdly enough, this kind of match-uppy thinking always existed in cricket. For instance, Sachin Tendulkar's bowling isn't mentioned much these days, but he was actually quite something. He would quite often bowl leg spin to one batter and then off spin to another. It was an oddity when he did it. Now it's a career arc for some modern spinners. Ajanta Mentis was certainly the most famous early T20 version of this. But there have been times in his career where R. Ashwin has been bowling leg spin to right-handers and off spin to southpaws. However, it was really Sunil Ryan who took over that Mendes-like crown and bettered it, making an incredible career by essentially spinning the ball in both directions as a finger spinner, which again existed before T20 but became a big business because of T20. And Narayan would actually be part of another trend, bowlers who could hit sixes. As a tail-ender, he knew early on that he didn't need to improve his batting, he needed his ability to hit what we now call maximums. This led to a new position in cricket, and something that David Willey has also done, this kind of permanent pinch hitter role. But we've only had a few of those sorts of players, but we've actually had quite a few bowlers spinning the ball in both directions. And if you want a good sign of where T20, but also cricket in general, is going, Sri Lanka hosting England in 2018 was a great sign for that. In the nets, you could see Joe Root practicing off-spin, leggies, also his version of a carom ball. In that same series, Sri Lanka used Kaminda Mendes, an ambidextrous bowler who would deliver with either arm depending on the matchup. Even outside of Joe Root, England has Liam Livingstone, who likes to turn the ball away from whatever kind of batter he's bowling to. Those are more micro things that are happening within the game, whereas left arm seam was obviously a major explosion, and the other big one was leg spin. There was a thought in early T20, although I think this is slightly overblown, but it was certainly there, that spinners weren't required. Weirdly after that, finger spin and leg spin got massively successful, and the thought with leg spin specifically was that it was because it was the least consistent and also conventional form of bowling. When you look at the data, however, that trend isn't really noticeable until after 2010, and this whole idea of the fact that leg spinners are less consistent isn't really true. In fact, is anyone more consistent at landing a ball on exactly the line and length that he wants than Rashid Khan? He's essentially Glenn McGrath but bowling leg spin. The very most basic reason that leg spinners had success is because they had the ability to spin the ball both ways. That means they're much harder to line up than other bowlers unless you're picking them, and even when you're picking them, there's going to be a slight delay there. And after leg spin, it was obviously left arm wrist spin, which is even less seen, and for whatever reason seems harder to pick when you're spinning the ball in both directions. So you suddenly have a career like Brad Hogg, who was basically dusted off from retirement. Not basically, he was completely dusted off from retirement, and then started almost a new trend on his own. It was also around this time that spin moved into the power play. Now, Deepak Patel did that for New Zealand in the 1992 World Cup, and it occasionally happened in Asia as well. But with T20, it really came back in, so much so that part-timers would often bowl the first over of an innings. To mention Joe Root again, and I'm not sure why in the evolution of T20 cricket Joe Root is suddenly so important, but he used to do that for Yorkshire. That was actually one of his early roles when he was a younger player. But perhaps the most noticeable spinner in the early part of the game was Samuel Badree, who made an incredible career out of it as an opening bowler for the West Indies and occasionally for franchises, bowling leg spin. And in case you've forgotten, during his career, the West Indies won 2 World Cups. The other thing is, with wrist spin, is the revolutions on the ball are absolutely massive. That means that the ball drops. That means that the ball can drift more than you can get with a finger spinner. It means that it bounces inconsistently as well. There's just so many things that make it slightly harder to line up. Yes, leg spinners still bowl worse balls than other bowlers, but that plays into the inconsistent nature at some times. But clearly it's more than just inconsistency, because we do have so many leg spinners who are incredibly accurate. So it must be something to do with the revolutions on the ball. And I think without doubt, the ball that gets the most revolutions in cricket would be a leg spinner. And of course, the West Indies in many ways changed T20 cricket. Their players became the early experts in it because they played so much in so many different leagues around the world, and they took it seriously well before anyone else did. And of course they did. It became their main livelihood. So they were pretty much the first freelancers in cricket as well. They learnt many small lessons along the way, but there was one major one, which is that 6 runs were truly a maximum, and they had no fear of the dot ball. Their thinking was, if the ball was in their zone, they would try and hit it for 6. If it wasn't, they would happily take up a dot ball instead of looking for a slightly dangerous single or even trying to turn a single into 2 runs. There was risk there. If they were going to take a risk, it was going to be on a 4 or a 6. The problem over time was that obviously teams actually worked out where not to bowl to the West Indies, which meant that a lot of their players did get bogged down, or that they had to play big shots against balls that they weren't particularly good against. And for other teams, they just didn't have those consistent power hitters that the West Indies had. And at the same time the West Indies perfected this, England as a team came up with a new method, probably partly inspired by the old Pro 40 cricket and the amount of throwdowns that English cricketers seem to receive. They essentially backed their players to attack almost every ball, but then supported them by batting as deep as possible. In the 2016 World Cup, Adil Rashid and his 10 first-class hundreds were batting at number 11. That is not a normal thing. And part of England's changes were from Trevor Bayliss telling players to back their skills, but there was also the fact that they had Nathan Lehman, who was their analyst. Even when he was working for England, he would form the company CricViz that really started the second wave of cricket analysis through the use of Hawkeye technology, or ball path, I suppose, as we call it now. Around this time, there seemed to be other small changes as well. The Jamaica Tellers won the CPL with the general manager named Muhammad Khan, who had come from Wall Street. People from the gambling industry and data analysts from all different kinds of worlds started working for teams. Cricket's first specialist keeping coach was seen at the Calcutta Knight Riders. Fast bowling gurus and hitting consultants started appearing everywhere. And batters continued their transformation from small to large through conditioning and looking after their body correctly. Where we put the fielders also started to change. Third and fine leg were standard positions in ODI cricket until around the 2000s, where fine leg came up into the circle as deep backward square went out. In the early part of T20, third came up as well, as teams started slamming the ball through the offside. And so the sweeper became more important than third. For a long time, having someone between point and cover on the boundary was a near automatic position, until about a year and a half ago when teams started putting players at backward point on the boundary. Probably because players were slashing the ball away in the power play. And as slower balls have become more and more common, third and fine leg have moved up almost permanently into the circle for certain kinds of bowlers. And part of the reason for that is because there are more off-pace deliveries now, and so hitting the ball to third or to fine leg is not quite as easy as it used to be. Even the scoop is a very hard shot to play when someone is bowling with no pace on the ball. Whether it be Tilakaratne Dilshan's Dil Scoop, which is almost never played actually, but versions of Douglas Marilia's scoop or Mel Loy's pace sweep or the Ryan Campbell shot, they all weaponize that area behind the crease. But without pace, it's actually been harder for batters over the last couple of years to continually access those. So in some ways, we're seeing less scoops than we did a few years earlier. Another reason is just because bowlers now have the ability to bowl a slower ball at the last minute. If they see a batter get into a different position, they can just take all the pace off it, and you have to premeditate any of those shots. And in one way or another, slower balls have been around since the early 1980s, with Franklin Stevenson's off-cutter and Simon O'Donnell's back-of-the-hand deliveries. But for a long time, you had a few bowlers who delivered them regularly. Now, it's almost impossible to bowl at the top level of professional cricket without having a slow ball. Not to mention that old-fashioned balls like the leg cutter have come back into vogue, and the knuckleball is finally being perfected in cricket. I think the perception is that slower balls are probably still delivered more than they actually are. But we've certainly gone beyond a tipping point now, and it is really hard to make a living as a seam bowler in T20 cricket without one regular slower ball. And what we are starting to see now is even the convergence of fast bowling and spin bowling more and more, as the fast bowlers put more revolutions on the ball and the spin bowlers start to look at some of the tricks from the fast bowlers. And the first case we saw of that, of course, was Sunil Narine. Again, this is his third entry on the Evolution of T20. He's a very important player, isn't he? But here's knuckleball. I don't think that's going to be the last crossover between pace and spin. Essentially, the back of the hand slow ball is a wrong un already. And then you've got players like Benny Howe. We're just going to see more and more crossover between pace and spin in the next few years. And quick bowlers aren't just slowing down and putting more revs on the ball, they're actually looking at other methods as well. Obviously, a few years ago, we saw the whole wide Yorker, which was another rehash from the 90s. But this time, they really went all in on it. And batters were just as quick to work out how to handle it. And despite many fans asking for Yorkers, batters worked those out well. First, it was with scoops, but then latterly, it's been with extreme movement around the crease. How can you hit a Yorker length consistently if the batter's never standing in the same position consistently? We now see batters move all the way back to the stumps. That was just something that we never saw in cricket before. And they also still come forward as well, not charging as much as they did in, say, again, the 80s and 90s, but batting out of their crease. And on top of all that, the bats are just stronger at the toe, meaning that finding that almost non-existent Yorker spot is harder than it has ever been in cricket. And if you miss it, there is a chance you will just go for six. It's literally dot ball or six with some of those deliveries. Fast bowlers have tried other methods, like back of a length at the body, or even lately coming around the wicket and aiming at the back heel. I suppose all heels are back heel, but you know what I mean. Even off spinners to right-handers have tried that same thing. Finger spinners have also tried to bowl wide, low arm deliveries. Rian Parag's arm dropped so far that the umpires have to check it to make sure that it isn't a no ball for lack of height. And that is what players are doing. They are pushing the laws and the playing conditions of the game a lot. Like when Kieran Pollard was intentionally running one short so that he could make sure that he got one run, but also still got the strike back. Of course, then the MCC changed that law. The ICC of recent times have been looking at the zombie ball, which I made an entire video about, where essentially you can be out caught and out run out at the same time, and no one's quite sure if there's a better solution than we currently have. And the other thing that is quite interesting is that we have had T20 games that have had a slightly delayed start, as both teams are changing their matchup between their opening batters and their opening bowlers, trying to make sure that that first delivery is absolutely maximised for them. But there was an incredible game of T20 cricket played in England this year that should be pointed out. Carlos Brathwaite was walking from the field in the last over of Birmingham, despite having not been dismissed. And in the next inning, Samit Patel did the same thing off the final ball for Notts, again, having not been dismissed. Both of these incredible players were leaving the wicket voluntarily. They were retired out, and their teams made these calls tactically. Brathwaite had struggled with leg spin earlier in the innings, and to be honest, all the way through his career. And so when he saw Calvin Harrison coming on to bowl that final over, he left the field. For the last ball of the game for Notts, they were batting and they needed 3 runs. Samit was at the non-strikers end, and so they substituted on a quicker runner. In the IPL, we saw R. Ashwin retire out strategically when he was struggling to hit a boundary. We've also seen that actually happen quite a bit at the women's and the associate level, where perhaps games in lower crowd, you can be a little bit more adventurous with your strategy. When all these retired outs have happened, people have started to talk. You know, suddenly we've got to the point where a wicket means so little in T20 that teams are happy to give one up. And other people are saying, well, shouldn't they lose a ball? And it's a fair question, because should you be able to donate a wicket without losing a ball? What it tells you more than anything else is that T20 cricket is evolving into a sport where we try and maximise every single delivery. So much so that teams are willing to lose 2 wickets on 1 ball. Welcome to the evolution of T20 cricket.